My parents made us all share one bedroom for closeness, until I found out why they really did it. I was 12 when Dad knocked down the walls between our 3 bedrooms with a sledgehammer, saying families who sleep together stay together. Mom stood in the doorway filming him, narrating about how American culture had poisoned us with individualism and privacy. My older brother Caleb was 15 and looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. My little sister Meadow was only 7 and kept asking if this meant we were getting bunk beds. Dad laughed and said we were getting something better than bunk beds. We were getting unity. The sledgehammer came down again and drywall exploded into white powder that covered everything. Mom posted the video to her wellness blog that night with the caption, "Radical family healing begins with radical vulnerability." The comments section filled up with heart emojis and people saying they wished they were brave enough to do this. Nobody questioned why a licensed therapist and a software engineer decided their children needed to sleep in one giant room with no doors and no privacy. Nobody asked if we wanted this. We just woke up one Saturday morning to the sound of destruction, and Mom's voice saying this was going to save our family. By Sunday afternoon, our house had been transformed. 3 bedrooms became one massive space with our beds arranged in a circle like wagon train settlers preparing for attack. Dad installed industrial shelving units where the walls used to be, saying we'd share everything now because private possessions bred secrecy and distance. My books went on communal shelves next to Caleb's gaming equipment and Meadow's stuffed animals. Mom gathered all our clothes into shared bins organized by type rather than person. She explained that in many cultures, families shared everything, and those cultures had stronger bonds than ours. I watched Caleb's jaw clench as she folded his favorite band t-shirt into a bin labeled casual tops that Meadow could theoretically wear too. The first night in our new configuration, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling that now stretched endlessly above all 4 of us. Caleb was reading with a flashlight, trying to create some bubble of privacy through literature. Meadow talked nonstop about her day, until Mom gently reminded her that nighttime was for rest and reflection. Dad announced he'd be checking on us throughout the night to ensure we were building healthy sleep patterns together. I didn't understand what that meant until 2 a.m., when I woke to find him sitting in a chair between our beds, just watching us sleep. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was bearing witness to our family's healing. He stayed there until dawn. I couldn't fall back asleep with his eyes moving from bed to bed, lingering on each of us like he was memorizing something. In the morning, he looked energized while I felt hollowed out from exhaustion. Mom's blog exploded after she posted about our sleeping arrangement. Parenting magazines requested interviews about her revolutionary approach to family cohesion. She appeared on a local morning show explaining how Western society's obsession with privacy was destroying the nuclear family. The host asked about boundaries and personal space, and Mom laughed like the question was adorable and naive. She said boundaries were just walls we built to keep love out, and our family was tearing those walls down literally and figuratively. The segment ended with the host looking uncomfortable, but thanking Mom for her bold perspective. Dad recorded the entire thing and played it back for us that evening in our bedroom, pausing to point out moments where Mom had perfectly articulated their philosophy. He seemed proud in a way that made my stomach hurt. Meadow clapped because she didn't understand what was happening. Dad started working from home more, setting up his laptop in our shared bedroom so he could be present during our family togetherness. He'd take video calls with clients while we did homework, occasionally panning the camera to show our unified space. He told his colleagues we were participating in an experiment about collaborative living. Some of them seemed impressed. Others made awkward comments about privacy that Dad deflected with statistics about families in other cultures who slept in single rooms. I noticed he never mentioned that those families usually had separate spaces for older children, or that their cultural context was completely different from ours. Caleb pointed this out once, and Dad accused him of using intellectualism as a defense mechanism against emotional growth. Mom nodded approvingly and wrote something in the journal she'd started keeping about our family's transformation. Caleb started changing clothes in the bathroom, the only room with a door that's still locked. Mom noticed immediately and called a family meeting in our bedroom circle. She sat on the floor between our beds and asked Caleb why he was retreating into shame and secrecy. He said he just wanted privacy while changing, which seemed reasonable to me. Mom said privacy while changing implied there was something shameful about our bodies, and shame was poison that destroyed families from the inside out. She suggested we start changing clothes together in our bedroom, to normalize our natural forms and eliminate toxic modesty. Caleb's face went white. Dad supported the idea enthusiastically, saying he and Mom would participate too to model healthy comfort with vulnerability. I watched my 15-year-old brother calculate whether this argument was worth having. He changed in the bathroom anyway. Mom documented his resistance to healing in her journal. The night checks became routine. Dad would wake us around 2 a.m., sitting in his chair with a small lamp, watching. Sometimes he'd write in a notebook. Sometimes he'd just stare. When I asked Mom about it the next morning, she explained that Dad was practicing mindful presence and teaching us that love meant constant attention. She said children in our culture were neglected because parents gave them too much space, too much privacy, too much room to develop problems in isolation. By maintaining presence, Dad was preventing the kind of secrecy that led to teenage rebellion, drug use, and suicide. She said this like it was obvious. Like we should be grateful Meadow seemed to accept it easily, because 7-year-olds adapt to anything adults normalize. Caleb started sleeping with his back to Dad's chair. I just stopped sleeping well. My grades dropped within a month because I couldn't focus through the exhaustion. My English teacher, Mrs. Kozlov, noticed I was falling asleep in class. She kept me after school one day and asked if everything was okay at home. I wanted to tell her about the bedroom, about Dad watching us sleep, about how I couldn't remember the last time I'd been alone with my own thoughts. But Mom's voice was in my head saying that discussing family matters with outsiders was a betrayal of our intimate circle. She'd said this explicitly during one of our evening sessions where we sat in our bedroom and shared feelings. Anyone who couldn't understand our family's journey toward radical closeness wasn't someone we needed in our lives. Mrs. Kozlov waited for my answer with kind eyes, and I told her I was fine, just staying up too late reading. She didn't look convinced, but let me go. I walked home knowing I'd missed an opportunity, but I didn't know how to explain something that sounded insane when you said it out loud. Mom started a podcast called The Intimate Family, where she interviewed other parents who'd adopted unconventional approaches to child rearing. One episode featured a family who'd removed all bathroom doors. Another showcased parents who read their teenagers' diaries as collaborative journaling. The common thread was eliminating privacy in service of closeness, and Mom positioned herself as a thought leader in this movement. Her follower count grew. Companies sent free products hoping she'd promote them to her audience of parents, eager to revolutionize their family dynamics. Dad appeared on episodes talking about how our sleeping arrangement had deepened his connection with his children. He described watching us sleep as a spiritual practice. Thousands of people listened and thought this was beautiful. None of them asked us how we felt about being observed in our most vulnerable state every single night. The house stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a stage. Mom installed additional cameras in our shared bedroom, explaining they were for content creation, but also for safety. She could check on us from work now, make sure we were maintaining the family unity even when she wasn't physically present. The cameras had night vision. I discovered this when I woke up at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and saw the small red lights glowing from 3 different angles. Dad wasn't in his chair that night, but the cameras were watching instead. I felt like an insect in a jar, constantly observed, never private. Caleb started hanging a blanket over his bed like a fort, trying to create some illusion of separation. Mom took it down the next morning and lectured us about symbolic walls being just as damaging as physical ones. She said we were backsliding, resisting the healing that was available to us if we'd just surrendered to vulnerability. School became my only escape, but even that was compromised. Mom volunteered to be a classroom parent, showing up during lunch to check on the family's collective energy. She'd sit with me and my friends asking invasive questions about our relationships and feelings while positioning it as caring involvement. My friends started avoiding me. Mom noticed and said this was revealing their shallow capacity for authentic connection. She wasn't wrong that they were pulling away, but she was completely wrong about why I was becoming the weird kid whose mom talked about radical vulnerability and whose family slept in one room. When I tried to explain this to Mom, she said I was choosing peer acceptance over family loyalty, which was a sign I'd been contaminated by American individualism. She scheduled an extra family session that night where we all had to share what family meant to us. Meadow said family was being together. Caleb said nothing. Dad watched us with shining eyes. I felt like I was drowning. The breaking point should have come when Caleb stopped eating dinner with us. He'd grab food and eat in the bathroom, the only place he could be alone. Mom called this food isolation and said it was a gateway to eating disorders and self-harm. She instituted a new rule. All meals had to be eaten together in our shared bedroom, sitting in our circle. Caleb complied but stopped talking during meals. Mom interpreted his silence as depression and scheduled him for therapy with one of her colleagues who specialized in adolescent resistance to family intimacy. The therapist told Caleb he was engaging in destructive behavior by pursuing privacy and autonomy. He came home from that session looking like something had broken inside him. I wanted to ask what happened, but there was nowhere to have a private conversation. Everything occurred in the shared bedroom under Dad's watching eyes and Mom's camera lenses. We existed in constant exposure, performing closeness while dying inside. I started spending hours in the bathroom too, claiming stomach problems. It was the only door that locked, the only space where nobody could watch me. Mom began timing my bathroom visits with genuine concern on her face. She said extended time alone could indicate suicidal ideation or self-harm, and she couldn't let me engage in risky isolation. She asked if I was hurting myself in there. The question was absurd until I realized I had started scratching at my arms, creating small red lines that gave me something to focus on. Besides the crushing weight of constant observation, I wasn't trying to hurt myself. I was trying to feel like my body was mine, that some part of me existed outside of the family's collective ownership. But I couldn't explain this to Mom because any assertion of individual experience was treated as pathological resistance. She installed a timer on the bathroom door, 10 minutes maximum. After that, she'd knock and ask if I needed help. Help meant supervision. Help meant never being alone again. The real horror crystallized when I overheard Mom on a video call with another intimacy parenting advocate. I was supposed to be asleep, but Dad wasn't in his chair that night and I'd gotten up for water. Mom's voice carried from her office, excited and animated. She was explaining how our family's sleeping arrangement had broken down the walls of adolescent rebellion and created access to our children's inner lives that most parents never achieve. The other person asked about pushback from the children, and Mom laughed. She said the initial resistance was expected, but manageable through consistent reframing and limiting external influences. She said removing privacy wasn't about control. It was about creating conditions where secrecy became impossible. Without secrecy, children couldn't develop the hidden selves that led to teenage deception, substance abuse, and suicide. She said our family was becoming a model for others. I stood in the dark hallway and understood for the first time that this wasn't about closeness. This was about control disguised as connection, surveillance disguised as love. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to Caleb's breathing and Meadow's small snores. Dad's chair sat empty but present, a throne of observation waiting for its occupant. The cameras blinked their red lights. The circle of beds felt less like family unity and more like a prison designed to look like intimacy. I thought about Mom's words, creating conditions where secrecy became impossible. That's what this was. Not bringing us closer together, but eliminating our ability to exist as individuals with internal lives separate from the family collective. Every private thought had to become shared property. Every feeling had to be processed in the bedroom circle. Every moment had to be witnessed and documented and analyzed for signs of resistance to healing. I was 12 years old, and I didn't have words for what was being done to us, but I knew it was wrong. The wrongness lived in my bones, in the exhaustion that never lifted, in the way Caleb had stopped making eye contact with any of us. The next morning, I tried a different approach with Mrs. Kozlov. Instead of saying everything was fine, I asked if it was normal for families to share one bedroom. She paused in her grading and looked at me carefully. She asked how many people, and I said 4. 2 adults and 3 children. She asked if everyone was comfortable with the arrangement, and I didn't know how to answer because comfort wasn't a concept that existed in our house anymore. We had unity and closeness and vulnerability, but not comfort. She must have seen something in my face because she asked permission to speak with the school counselor about resources for my family. I panicked and said no, everything was fine. My parents were just trying something different. Mrs. Kozlov didn't push, but she looked worried in a way that made me feel both hopeful and terrified. If she reported something, would it help or would it make everything worse? Mom had told us repeatedly that the outside world wouldn't understand our family's healing journey, that conventional people would try to impose their limited thinking on our expanded consciousness. That afternoon, the school counselor called me to her office anyway. Ms. Reeves was young and earnest, and she asked directly if I felt safe at home. The question hung in the air between us. I felt safe from physical harm. Dad had never hit us. Mom had never been violent. But did I feel safe? No, I felt watched and controlled and like I was disappearing into the family collective, losing myself piece by piece. But how do you explain that you're being harmed by too much attention, too much closeness, too much love? It sounded ridiculous. I told Ms. Reeves I felt safe. She asked about the shared bedroom, and my heart stopped because someone had definitely told her I said it was my parents' choice and we were adjusting fine. She explained gently that children deserved privacy and personal space, that sharing a room wasn't inherently harmful, but eliminating all privacy could be. She gave me her card and said I could talk to her anytime. I took the card and never called. I was too afraid of what would happen if I betrayed the family circle. Mom found out about the counselor meeting because the school sent a courtesy notification to parents. She was furious in that calm, therapeutic way she'd perfected. That evening's family session lasted 3 hours. We sat in our bedroom circle while Mom facilitated a discussion about loyalty and betrayal. She said outside institutions didn't understand our family's journey and would try to sabotage our progress with conventional thinking. She said Mrs. Kozlov and Ms. Reeves were projecting their own family wounds onto us, seeing pathology where there was actually pioneering intimacy work. Dad agreed passionately, explaining how the education system was designed to separate children from families, to create loyalty to peers and teachers instead of parents. He said we needed to be more careful about what we shared with outsiders who lacked the consciousness to understand our path. Meadow nodded seriously, parroting their language. Caleb stared at the floor. I promised to be more careful, knowing I'd just lost my only potential lifeline. The cameras blinked their red lights, recording our recommitment to family unity. Things escalated after that. Mom and Dad implemented new protocols to strengthen our isolation from corrupting external influences. Caleb wasn't allowed to have friends over anymore because visitors disrupted our family's energetic field. I couldn't attend sleepovers because sleeping outside the family circle would undermine the neural patterns we were building through shared rest. Meadow was pulled from her soccer team because extracurricular activities were creating divided loyalties. We existed in an increasingly tight circle. Home, school, home again. The shared bedroom became our entire world. Dad's night checks became more frequent. Sometimes he'd wake us to process feelings he sensed we were suppressing. Mom would join these midnight sessions, both of them sitting in chairs while we sat up in our beds, half asleep, trying to articulate vulnerabilities we didn't feel. It was exhausting in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of having no interior life, no private self, no moment unobserved. Mom's blog posts became more extreme as her follower count grew. She wrote about breaking through children's defensive barriers, and excavating authentic selfhood beneath socialized privacy responses. Other parents commented asking for advice on implementing similar systems. Mom started offering online courses on intimate family restructuring. She charged $500 for a 4-week program teaching parents how to eliminate privacy in service of deeper connection. Dozens of families enrolled. Dad quit his software job to help manage Mom's growing wellness empire built on the destruction of children's boundaries. They filmed content in our bedroom constantly. We became unwilling actors in their production of family healing. Caleb stopped resisting and became compliant in a dead-eyed way that scared me more than his earlier anger. Meadow thought everything was normal because she'd been young enough when this started to not remember how families usually worked. I felt myself splitting in two, the self that performed closeness for my parents and the self that screamed silently inside the performance. The night Caleb tried to run away, I was awake when he quietly gathered clothes into a backpack. It was 4 a.m. Dad wasn't in his chair, but the cameras were watching with their red lights. I whispered, asking where he was going, and Caleb said, "Anywhere else." I wanted to go with him, but Meadow was asleep and I couldn't leave her alone in this. Caleb understood. He touched my hand once and slipped out through the bedroom's single entrance. I lay awake listening for the front door. For any sound of escape, instead, I heard Dad's voice, calm and therapeutic, asking Caleb where he thought he was going. I heard Mom join them. Their voices rose and fell in the living room, processing Caleb's crisis of connection and flight response to intimacy. Caleb came back to the bedroom an hour later and got into his bed without speaking. His backpack was gone. In the morning, Mom called his therapist for an emergency session. They decided Caleb needed more intensive support, which meant Dad would now sleep in the bedroom with us rather than just visiting. A fourth bed appeared. Our circle became tighter. There was no escape. Dad's constant presence changed everything. The night checks had been invasive, but at least they ended. Now he was always there, watching us sleep, waking us to discuss dreams, processing every sigh and shift as meaningful communication. He'd wake me at 3 a.m. to ask what I was feeling. Half asleep, I'd say, tired. And he'd spend 30 minutes helping me understand that tiredness was often masking deeper emotions. I was afraid to acknowledge Mom installed more cameras, angled to capture our faces from multiple perspectives. She explained this was for pattern recognition, to identify microexpressions that indicated suppressed trauma. I asked what trauma she was looking for, and she said all children had trauma from living in a privacy-obsessed culture, and our family was healing that original wound through radical transparency. The logic was circular and inescapable. Any resistance proved we were traumatized. Any compliance proved the healing was working. There was no way to win. My 13th birthday came without celebration. Mom said birthday parties reinforced individualism and specialness hierarchies that were toxic to family cohesion. Instead, we had a family integration ceremony, where we all wore matching white shirts and sat in our bedroom circle sharing appreciation for each other's existence. Dad gave a speech about how my entry into adolescence would be different from other children's, because I wouldn't disappear into peer culture, and secret keeping I'd remain embedded in family consciousness, supported through every change. Mom filmed everything. Meadow made me a card. Caleb gave me a look that said he understood how trapped I felt. That look was the only real gift I received. That night, Dad woke me at midnight and said we needed to process my transition into young adulthood. He sat on the edge of my bed and talked for an hour about bodies and changes and the importance of sharing these experiences with family rather than hiding them in shame. Every word made my skin crawl. When he finally returned to his own bed, I lay rigid, understanding with absolute clarity that something was deeply wrong with what was happening in this room. I started documenting everything in a notebook I kept in my school locker, the only space my parents couldn't access. I wrote about the cameras, the night wakings, the constant observation, the way Caleb had stopped being a person and become a compliant shell. I wrote about Dad sleeping in our room and his midnight conversations about my changing body. I wrote about Mom's blog posts and the money she was making teaching other parents how to eliminate their children's privacy. I didn't know what I'd do with this documentation, but writing it down made it real outside my own head. It confirmed I wasn't crazy or ungrateful or damaged by privacy culture. Something genuinely harmful was happening in our house, disguised as revolutionary family healing. Mrs. Kozloff noticed me writing and asked what I was working on. I said it was a journal for English class. She said journaling was good for processing difficult experiences. The way she emphasized difficult made me think she knew more than she was saying. The situation broke open in the most unexpected way. Mom's podcast was featured in a mainstream parenting magazine article about extreme intimacy parenting. The article was mostly positive, presenting Mom as a controversial but interesting voice in modern parenting discourse. But it included quotes from child psychologists warning that eliminating all privacy could be psychologically harmful, especially for adolescents developing identity separate from their parents. One psychologist explicitly said that constant observation and forced transparency could constitute emotional abuse. Mom was thrilled by the controversy because it drove traffic to her blog. She didn't seem to notice or care that professionals were calling her methods abusive. Dad framed it as conventional thinking, being threatened by our revolutionary approach. They doubled down, announcing on the podcast that they'd be sharing even more of our family journey to normalize what they called post-privacy parenting. That episode included audio of one of our midnight processing sessions, with our sleepy voices responding to Dad's questions. They'd recorded us without mentioning it would be broadcast to thousands of people. That episode reached someone it shouldn't have. Mom's older sister, Aunt Diane, who we rarely saw because Mom said she was stuck in toxic independence mindsets. Aunt Diane listened to her 12-year-old niece's exhausted voice answering questions at 3 a.m. about feelings and body changes, broadcast for entertainment and education. She called Mom immediately. I was in our shared bedroom doing homework when Mom took the call in the adjacent living room. Her voice started calm and therapeutic, explaining the family's journey, but Aunt Diane wasn't buying it. I heard her voice through the phone, loud enough to carry, "You're abusing those children and calling it healing." Mom's response was cold. She said Diane's judgment came from her own unresolved family trauma and fear of authentic intimacy. Aunt Diane said she was calling Child Protective Services. Mom laughed and said CPS would find a loving family engaged in alternative parenting, which wasn't illegal. She hung up, still smiling. Certain in her righteousness that night, she told us Aunt Diane might try to interfere with our healing journey, but we should trust that the family circle was wiser than external judgment. Aunt Diane did call CPS. A caseworker named Leslie Whitmore came to our house 3 days later. Mom was prepared, gracious, welcoming. She gave a tour of our shared bedroom. Explaining the philosophy behind our choice, Leslie saw the 4 beds in a circle, the cameras, the shared storage bins. She asked to speak with each of us individually. Mom said we were practicing radical transparency, so individual conversations would violate our family principles, but Leslie insisted it was protocol. Mom agreed with visible reluctance. Leslie talked to Caleb first, in the living room with the door closed. He was in there for 20 minutes. Then me. Leslie asked direct questions. Did I feel safe? Could I have privacy when I needed it? Did anyone touch me inappropriately? I answered carefully, aware that Mom would interrogate me about this conversation later. I said I felt safe. I said privacy wasn't really part of our family's values, but I was adjusting. I said no one hurt me physically. All technically true, but missing the real horror of constant surveillance and forced emotional exposure. Leslie spoke with Meadow, who enthusiastically described our family unity and how much she loved everyone sleeping together. Then Leslie talked to my parents together for nearly an hour. When she left, Mom was triumphant. She said Leslie had been initially skeptical, but ultimately saw that we were a healthy family with unconventional practices. Dad said the investigation would close with no findings because nothing illegal was occurring. They were right. 3 weeks later, we received a letter stating the case was closed. The caseworker had found no evidence of physical abuse or neglect. Unconventional sleeping arrangements weren't sufficient grounds for intervention. The cameras were presented as security measures. The constant observation was framed as involved parenting. Nothing in the CPS handbook specifically prohibited parents from sleeping in the same room as their teenage children or waking them for emotional processing sessions. We'd been failed by a system that could only recognize certain kinds of harm. The invisible abuse of destroyed boundaries and eliminated selfhood didn't register as actionable. Mom posted about the investigation on her blog, positioning it as persecution for revolutionary parenting. Her followers rallied with supportive comments. The incident became content, marketing, proof of their courage. But the CPS investigation did something important even though it didn't remove us from the home. It put our family on record. Leslie had documented everything. The shared bedroom, the cameras, the midnight sessions, Caleb's obvious distress, my exhaustion. She'd noted her concerns even while closing the case, and she'd given me her card with a direct number, telling me to call if anything changed. I kept that card in my school locker next to my documentation notebook. Small pieces of evidence that our reality was witnessed by someone outside the family circle. That night, Dad announced we'd be transitioning to authentic familial rest, which meant no pajamas, just underwear, to eliminate textile barriers to genuine vulnerability. Mom supported this enthusiastically. Caleb's face went white. I felt my stomach drop. This was escalating beyond psychological control into something that felt dangerous in a new way. Dad saw our expressions and said our resistance proved how deeply privacy culture had corrupted our ability to be natural with our family. He said we'd start the next night to give us time to process our discomfort. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did except Meadow. At 6 a.m., Caleb whispered that we had to tell someone what was really happening. I agreed but didn't know who would believe us. Our parents were educated, articulate, wealthy enough to have lawyers. They could frame anything as misunderstood progressive parenting. They had a blog and podcast proving their methods were intentional and theoretically grounded, not impulsive abuse. But Caleb said we had to try because whatever was coming next would be worse than anything so far. He was right. I could feel it. The trajectory was clear, incremental removal of boundaries until nothing remained, until we existed completely under their control with no interior lives, no private selves, no escape. We decided to go to school early and talk to both Mrs. Kozloff and Ms. Reeves together, present a united front, make them understand this wasn't typical family weirdness but something genuinely harmful. We had to make them see past our parents' therapeutic language to the reality underneath. We went to school at 7 a.m. before classes started. Mrs. Kozloff was setting up her classroom and Ms. Reeves was in her office. We asked them to meet with us together, and you could see the alarm in their faces when they saw Caleb and me both asking. We sat in Ms. Reeves's office, and I pulled out my documentation notebook. Caleb explained about Dad sleeping in our room now, and the plans to remove pajamas. I showed them pages of notes about midnight wakings and body conversations and constant observation. Mrs. Kozlov's expression shifted from concern to horror as she read Ms. Reeves asked permission to keep the notebook as evidence. I said yes. She made copies of key pages while Mrs. Kozlov called someone. Within an hour, Leslie Whitmore was back at the school. She read my notes. She listened to Caleb describe the escalation. She asked questions that showed she'd been worried about our case even after closing it. This time, she said, there was documented pattern of behavior and explicit plans for further boundary violations. This time, she could intervene. Leslie went to our house that afternoon with a police officer. Mom answered the door in the middle of filming a podcast episode about persisting through external resistance. Leslie presented an emergency removal order based on concerns about inappropriate sleeping arrangements with adolescent children and plans for forced nudity. Mom's face transformed from welcoming to furious. She said this was persecution for alternative parenting, and they had no right to destroy our family's healing journey. Dad appeared, equally angry, demanding to see the evidence. Leslie said there were credible reports from the children themselves about escalating boundary violations. Mom's face went pale. She asked which children. Leslie said that information was protected, but the removal was effective immediately. Police would stay while we packed essentials. Mom started crying, real tears, saying we were betraying the family circle and choosing privacy poison over authentic love. Dad looked at Caleb and me with something like hatred. He said we'd regret destroying our family over fear of vulnerability. We packed bags quickly while Mom sobbed in the living room, filming herself for content, narrating her persecution by a system that couldn't understand evolved family consciousness. We went to an emergency foster placement together, all three of us. The foster parents, Ian and Portia Chen, had a large house where each child had their own bedroom with a door that locked from the inside. The first night, I lay in a room alone for the first time in over a year. The silence was overwhelming. No breathing except my own, no cameras with red lights, no dad watching, no midnight wakings for emotional processing, just darkness and privacy, and a door I'd locked myself. I cried harder than I'd cried through everything else, because this felt like being human again. In the morning, Portia knocked gently and waited for me to answer before entering. The basic respect of that gesture broke something open in me. Caleb looked better after just one night of unobserved sleep. Even Meadow, who'd loved the family circle, seemed lighter without constant togetherness. We started to remember who we were as individuals instead of units in a collective consciousness. Mom and Dad launched a social media campaign about having their children stolen by a system that criminalized revolutionary parenting. Their followers flooded CPS phone lines with complaints. The local news covered it as a controversial case of parental rights versus child welfare. Mom appeared on television looking devastated, explaining how her therapeutic approach to family closeness was being mischaracterized as abuse. She showed pictures of our bedroom circle, describing it as love made visible. She cried about the trauma of forced separation. She never mentioned the cameras or the midnight wakings or the plan to remove our pajamas. Dad presented as a devoted father being punished for rejecting conventional parenting norms. They were convincing because they genuinely believed their own narrative. They couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge the harm they'd inflicted. The court ordered psychological evaluations for everyone. Caleb and I were evaluated by Dr. Nina Walsh, who specialized in family trauma. Over several sessions, we described what life had been like in the shared bedroom, the constant observation, the eliminated privacy, the forced emotional exposure, the escalating physical boundary violations. Dr. Walsh documented everything in her report to the court. She diagnosed us both with symptoms of complex psychological abuse resulting from systematic elimination of personal boundaries and autonomy. She noted that our parents' methods, while framed in therapeutic language, constituted emotional abuse and created conditions for potential sexual abuse through inappropriate sleeping arrangements and body-focused conversations. Her report was damning but clinical, translating our lived experience into professional terminology that courts could understand. Mom and Dad were evaluated by different psychologists who noted their genuine belief in their parenting philosophy, but also significant issues with boundaries, control, and inability to recognize their children as separate individuals with rights to privacy. The evaluations recommended supervised visitation only, with mandatory therapy for our parents before any consideration of custody return. Mom posted about the reports on her blog, calling them biased interpretations by conventionally minded professionals threatened by alternative consciousness. But the damage was done. The documentation existed. Multiple professionals had witnessed and named the harm. The custody hearing lasted 2 days. Mom and Dad presented character witnesses, fellow alternative parenting advocates who testified about their devotion and innovative approaches to family closeness. Mom's lawyer argued that their methods were unconventional, but not abusive, that removing children from loving parents for ideological differences was government overreach. Our lawyer presented my documentation notebook, CPS records, psychological evaluations, and testimony from Mrs. Kozlov and Ms. Reeves about our deteriorating condition under our parents' care. Caleb testified. his voice steady as he described what it felt like to have no privacy, no selfhood, no escape from constant observation. I testified about the cameras and the midnight wakings and the terror of knowing boundaries were being eliminated piece by piece. Meadow was deemed too young to testify, but her therapist reported that even she was beginning to express relief about having her own room and discomfort about returning to the shared bedroom. The judge listened to everything. She reviewed the evidence. She asked our parents directly if they understood why constant observation and elimination of privacy might be harmful to adolescent development. Mom answered with therapeutic conviction, explaining that privacy was a cultural construct that separated family members and created conditions for hidden trauma. She said conventional psychology was limited by its individualistic framework and couldn't comprehend the healing available through radical transparency. She was eloquent and earnest, and completely unable to hear how she sounded. The judge asked if she planned to continue requiring shared sleeping and constant observation if custody was returned. Mom said yes, absolutely, because that's what our family's healing required. The judge asked Dad the same question. He said they'd made tremendous progress toward authentic family consciousness, and returning to private bedrooms would undo that sacred work. He couldn't or wouldn't understand that what he called progress we experienced as destruction. The judge's face was unreadable, but I watched her make notes when both sides rested. She said she'd deliver a ruling within a week. We went back to Ian and Portia's house and waited. Caleb and I both knew what the ruling had to be, but we'd learned not to trust that adults would protect children when parents presented well. The ruling came 6 days later. The judge terminated Mom and Dad's custody, granting it to Aunt Diane, who'd been pursuing guardianship throughout the process. The decision cited systematic psychological abuse through elimination of privacy, inappropriate sleeping arrangements with adolescent children, forced emotional exposure, and inability to recognize harm caused by their methods. The judge noted that while the parents' beliefs were sincere, their implementation violated their children's basic rights to privacy, autonomy, and appropriate boundaries. Supervised visitation was allowed, but only in therapeutic settings with professionals present. Mom and Dad were ordered to complete family therapy and demonstrate understanding of appropriate boundaries before visitation could expand. We were free. The ruling was reported in the same outlets that had covered Mom's story about persecution. Some of her followers denounced the decision as government tyranny. Others quietly deleted their supportive comments, perhaps recognizing they'd endorsed something harmful. Mom's blog went private. Her podcast stopped updating the empire. Built on our destroyed boundaries collapsed once the harm was legally named and documented. Moving in with Aunt Diane felt surreal. She lived 3 hours away in a normal house with normal rules. Bedrooms with doors, privacy during changing, no cameras, no midnight emotional excavations. She was gentle with our adjustment, understanding we'd been trained to see privacy as betrayal and boundaries as barriers to love. She got us into therapy with specialists who understood cultic family dynamics and psychological abuse disguised as wellness practices. Slowly, we learned to exist as individuals again. Caleb's dead-eyed compliance faded, replaced by genuine personality. Meadow started expressing preferences and opinions instead of parroting family unity rhetoric. I relearned how to be alone with my thoughts without fear of surveillance or forced sharing. We healed in increments, discovering who we were without constant observation. Mom and Dad attended their mandated therapy, but their social media suggested they still viewed themselves as victims of a system that couldn't comprehend evolved consciousness. They never apologized. They never acknowledged harm. They couldn't see past their own narrative of revolutionary love to recognize they'd traumatized their children in service of control disguised as closeness. Supervised visits happened monthly in a therapist's office. Mom would cry and ask when we could be a family again. Dad would talk about the healing we were missing by choosing separation. They'd bring printouts of blog comments from followers who supported them, as if strangers' opinions mattered more than our lived experience. Meadow eventually stopped wanting to attend visits. Caleb went sporadically out of some complex sense of obligation. I went because Aunt Diane said it might help me process, but mostly I watched my parents perform their victimhood and felt nothing but relief that I'd never have to sleep in that circular arrangement again. The therapist noted their lack of progress toward understanding appropriate boundaries. After 2 years, the judge ruled that custody would remain permanently with Aunt Diane Mom, and Dad could continue supervised visits if we wanted them, but forced contact would end when we turned 18. They posted about this ruling as their final martyrdom, parents destroyed for loving too much. Their remaining followers shared and commented about family courts being weapons against alternative parenting. None of them asked us what it had been like to live under constant surveillance, to have no interior life, to be told that wanting privacy meant we were poisoned by culture and resisting love. I'm 18 now. Caleb is 21 and in college studying psychology, planning to specialize in family systems abuse. Meadow is 13 and thriving with her own room and normal teenage privacy. We're healing but scarred, understanding viscerally that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's control. It's consumption. It's the elimination of selfhood disguised as connection. Mom still blogs occasionally about her persecuted journey and the children stolen by a system afraid of authentic family consciousness. I don't read it anymore. I'm too busy learning to trust my own interior experience, to believe that privacy isn't poison but protection, that boundaries aren't barriers but the foundation of genuine relationship. The cameras are gone. The midnight wakings are over. The forced emotional excavations ended. I have a door that locks and thoughts that remain private and a self that exists, independent of family observation. That's not individualistic poison. That's being human. And I'm finally, slowly, learning what that means. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.